Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to class number 11 in Understanding Contemporary Art. For anyone interested in my take on Andy Warhol, it's the chapter that I wrote on him is in my book, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons. It's not in the other book, Art After Metaphysics, that the course is based on, so this book does not have my chapter on Andy Warhol. It's in this one, for those who are interested. But now, what I want to talk about in the second lecture on Andy Warhol is how Warhol, what I want to emphasize here is how Warhol in many respects became the prophet of the current age that we're living in now, the internet age, the YouTube age of the famous nobody, the age where the maximum YouTube upload limit now is 15 minutes, in homage to Warhol's statement that in the future everyone would become famous for 15 minutes, which was very prescient. And in a sense, I think Warhol was the first to understand. He made a lot of movies simply by placing cameras in front of people doing nothing special. He even wanted to make a television show called Nothing Special. And I think that he was one of the first to understand that fame, under the conditions of complete electronification of the society, could happen to anyone. No one has to do anything special when the entire planet has now fallen under the scrutiny of the mediatized eye, Paul Virilio's vision machine. No one has to do anything special. All you have to do is stand in front of a camera, and Warhol, I think, was very much the first to understand this. He would have appreciated things like YouTube's Lonely Girl 15, in which a 19-year-old girl was hired to play a 16-year-old girl sitting around in a room doing nothing special. These kinds of boring videos where nothing transpires except the act of fame itself were the essence of Andy Warhol's movies that he made. Now, I want to look at some more of the art here. This is 9 Jackies from 1964. And what I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that, notice the very fuzzy, grainy, low-resolution nature of the image that Warhol has here. Now, remember that with Mark Rothko, we had seen Rothko being very prescient about the coming of the video screen, about the ubiquity of the video monitor in his mature paintings. And here, I think, for the first time, Warhol represents really, I think, the first artist whose images were directly inspired by the low-resolution images on television screens and video monitors, but more in this case from the kinds of low-resolution television screens that were common in the 60s. Here we can see in this 1964 painting called Flowers, another very low-resolution image that now begins to become the trademark of his art at this time. Now, Warhol had spent his time through most of the 62 and 63 studying very famous individuals like Jackie Kennedy and Elizabeth Taylor and so forth. But now he wanted to turn his attention to the anonymously famous, the counter-concept to the celebrity, that is to say, the people who make headlines as the result of committing suicide by jumping off bridges and buildings, getting into car crashes. The anonymous nobodies who turn up and become momentarily famous, and that's what he turned his attention to now in the so-called Death and Disaster series that he created between 1962 and about 1964. Here we're looking at Orange Car Crash, 1964, where once again he uses the repetition aspect of the image to highlight and underscore how the media works by repetition. After 9/11 happened and we saw the planes crash into the buildings, we just constantly kept getting the same image repeating over and over and over and over again to inscribe it as a kind of Derridian mark in the cultural memory as something that cannot be forgotten. And that's what Warhol is playing with here in his repetition of these images. Also, I think these car crash paintings that he did from this period inspired J.G. Ballard to write his novel Crash, where the main character, one of the main characters, Vaughn, in that is based on Andy Warhol himself. Now, he was asked by Philip Johnson to contribute something to the 1964 New York State World's Fair, which was organized by Robert Moses. And Philip Johnson had built a building for that fair. Walt Disney also built some theme parks designs for GE and Ford, and also exhibited the first of his animatronic robots at that World's Fair. And Warhol's contribution here was to continue in the tradition of the anonymously famous by creating this mural on the back of Philip Johnson's building, which was a mural called Most Wanted Men. And it is composed of, I think, 25 squares of the most wanted fugitives from the FBI. But this gave Robert Moses pause, since most of the men on the image here are Italian, and he suspected that it could be interpreted as a racist statement, so he made Warhol efface the image, and Warhol simply covered it with silver spray paint, so he was not allowed to exhibit the image. But The key thing about it here is that Warhol once again is being very prescient about the coming of the explosion of the individual who can become famous for no particular reason other than doing something outrageous, committing acts of murder and so forth, in shows like America's Most Wanted that come later on, or Cops, or Oliver Stone's movie Natural Born Killers. All of that is very prescient here. It's in utero in this image, I think, from Warhol here at the New York State World's Fair. Then he was, here's another one of the death and disaster paintings here. This one is Red Disaster, from the period of the death and disaster paintings, where it shows the electric chair. The ultimate fate of the most wanted men is to be electrocuted. And of course, the electric chair is a means of the creation of death in a completely electronified society, which actually turns out, ironically, not to be humane at all, but one of the most cruel ways of executing people ever invented. And I think Warhol highlights that here with the very gloomy red overlayer that he gives to the image. It emphasizes individual death, whereas his painting here, Atomic Bomb, emphasizes collective death, the collective elimination of the race with apocalyptic imagery. I think the common perception of Warhol is that he was very glib, shallow, and superficial, and indeed, in a certain sense, he was that and enjoyed being that, but he also had depth to him. And the paintings from the Death and Disaster series, I think, reveal that there was a certain apocalyptic side to him as well. He was, after all, the first priest, or the first sort of high priest, symbolically anyway, of the cult of the dead celebrity, whom he was mummifying in his works of art here. Now, by the later 60s, here is his self-portrait of 1964, by the later 60s, he himself had become famous enough to then go back and serialize himself, to plug himself into the grid of repetition that he had already assigned for the famous, or the anonymously famous, and to plug himself into that grid, and once again to highlight fame by way of the process of simple repetition. The repetition of the mediatized image is what creates the avatar and the two-dimensional fame under totally electronic conditions. And here he is plugging himself back into his signature style. This is probably one of his most famous images here, the image of Mao from 1972, where Mao is flattened into a caricatured, mediatized stereotype. And then long about 1968, one Valerie Solanas showed up at his loft at the factory one day, walked up, shot him 3 or 4 times, and took the freight elevator down without making a sound. And this was the headline that appeared the next day, June 4th, 1968, actress shoots Andy Warhol. The fact that, in a certain way, his death and disaster paintings were already being, in a certain way, they were rehearsals for his own death. He was already looking ahead to his own death, although he did not die from this. That should be highlighted. He did survive the shooting, although just barely. He actually was, at one point, pronounced clinically dead, but he survived it. But it's interesting that one of the first death and disaster paintings here, this is from the same date, June 4th, only the headline is 1962, and it's a real headline, the New York Mirror, 129 die in jet, and this was one of the first of the death and disaster works that he did. And so once again, there's a kind of weird foreshadowing of the fact that he becomes one of the first great celebrities, and by this point he had become a celebrity, to generate his own stalker. And the celebrity is the one who has become sufficiently famous to have generated so many doppelgangers, so many electric avatars and doppelgangers of himself, that the doppelgangers now begin to attract stalkers. And there is, in a sense, there's a certain way in which Andy Warhol can be regarded as a kind of modified celebrity stalker. The repetition of the famous in his images and the way he serializes them has a kind of OCD quality about it, the kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder that the stalker has. And for a brief period of time, he actually did stalk Truman Capote until Capote's mother told him to go away. So there is a certain sense, there's a stalker-like nature to Warhol, and I think that it's appropriate that he did attract a stalker into his life who then shot him and nearly killed him. And in a certain sense, his autobiography, Popism, ends with the shooting forms the climax of that book. In a certain sense, it really was the end of his life. The sort of Warhol that is resurrected from the shooting, the later art is not as good. He didn't hang around anymore with the crazies from whom he derived so much inspiration. Instead, he hung around with the rich and famous, and he did caricatures of them and almost reduced his art to the status of a caricature in the later art. So it was really never as good. His best work, I think, as an artist was done by 1968. And so the shooting is a kind of Lacanian punctuation point that really marks the end of the phase of the great artist, Andy Warhol.